There is a book
Oh
sitting
my
inside the Ethiopian
God. What is
Orthodox
it?
biblical canon that most of the Christian
Skeletons.
world has never
Skeletons!
heard of.
Yes.
It was written in
There's
the
one problem
2nd
with that.
century.
What's that?
It was
The
quoted by
Grail
name for
cannot
hundreds
pass
of
beyond
years
the
by the
Great
earliest
Seal.
church fathers.
It's not the
And then it
Grail.
vanished
That
so
is the
completely
boundary
from the
pierce.
historical
That is the
record that
price
for
of
over a
immortality.
millennium, scholars assumed it was lost forever, along with whatever it had to say about the end of the world, the resurrection of the dead, and the fate of every soul standing in judgment before Christ. It wasn't lost. It was in Ethiopia the entire time, copied by hand, generation after generation, inside a biblical tradition 35 books larger than the Bible most of the world reads today. And when Western scholars finally got their hands on it, in a French library, in a stack of manuscripts nobody had bothered to translate, what they found didn't just fill in a historical gap. It forced a reckoning with how the earliest Christians actually pictured resurrection, judgment, and the private moment when the risen Jesus is said to have pulled his closest followers aside and told them exactly what was coming. This is the real story of that discovery, and it is stranger and more historically significant than almost anyone realizes. To understand why this text survived only in Ethiopia, you have to understand what the Ethiopian Bible actually is, because it is not a curiosity or a variant edition. It is, by every measure scholars use, the largest and most complete biblical canon in continuous use anywhere in Christendom. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes 81 books as scripture, 46 in the Old Testament, 35 in the New. Compare that to the 66 books most Protestant Bibles contain, or the 73 recognized by the Catholic Church, and the gap becomes obvious immediately. 15 additional books beyond even the Catholic canon, some of them texts that don't exist in complete form in any other living Christian tradition on earth. The Church has used this canon since antiquity, written in Guizi, a liturgical language that stopped being spoken in daily life over 1,000 years ago, but never stopped being read, chanted, and copied inside Ethiopian monasteries. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia extraordinarily early, traditionally dated to the 4th century under the missionary bishop Frumentius, consecrated by Athanasius of Alexandria himself. 416 centuries afterward, the Ethiopian Church operated under the ecclesiastical authority of the Coptic Church in Egypt, absorbing and preserving texts that circulated in the wider late antique Christian world of the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Here is the detail that matters most for this story. Ethiopia was geographically and politically isolated from the councils and controversies that shaped the biblical canon everywhere else. The Ethiopian Church was never part of the ecumenical councils that hammered out which books belonged in Scripture and which didn't for the rest of Christendom. That isolation is usually described as a limitation. It was actually a preservation mechanism. While Rome, Constantinople, and later the Reformation churches were actively narrowing what counted as Scripture, trimming out texts they considered too strange, too apocalyptic, or too theologically risky, Ethiopian monasteries simply kept copying what they had always copied. Nobody was pressuring them to conform to a shrinking consensus. The result is a library of ancient Christian and Jewish religious texts that, in several cases, exist nowhere else on earth in complete form. Scholars didn't discover Ethiopia's Bible so much as they discovered that Ethiopia had spent over 1,000 years quietly guarding manuscripts the rest of the Christian world had lost, banned, or forgotten it ever had. The most famous example, and the one that set the pattern for everything that came after it, is the Book of Enoch. Enoch is mentioned only briefly in Genesis, a man who is said to have walked with God and then was simply taken, without dying. But an entire tradition of visionary literature grew up around his name in the centuries before Christ, describing fallen angels called Watchers, a coming judgment, and the hidden architecture of the heavens. The early church quoted this material. The letter of Jude, part of the New Testament itself, directly cites a prophecy attributed to Enoch. But as the biblical canon solidified across the Mediterranean world, Enoch's book was left out everywhere except Ethiopia, where it had been fully translated and treated as scripture for centuries. By the early modern period, European scholars assumed the complete text simply no longer existed. It survived only in scattered quotations from church fathers who clearly had access to something more than fragments. Then, in 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce returned from 6 years exploring the source of the Blue Nile, and he brought back 3 complete Guizi manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. When word of this got out, a fair number of scholars in Europe simply didn't believe him. It sounded too convenient, too neat, that a text quoted by the Apostle Jude and referenced obliquely by early Christian writers for centuries had simply been sitting intact in an African monastery the entire time, waiting for a European to stumble onto it. Richard Lawrence of Oxford eventually produced the first English translation in 1821, and the book slowly entered Western biblical scholarship as an important but unverified curiosity, its authenticity still disputed by critics who suspected the Ethiopian version might be a much later, less reliable elaboration rather than a faithful record of an ancient original. The doubt held for over a century. Then, between 1947 and 1956, archaeologists working the caves near Qumran on the shore of the Dead Sea uncovered roughly 900 ancient texts, a discovery that reshaped the study of Second Temple Judaism entirely. Among those Dead Sea Scrolls were Aramaic fragments of Enoch, dated to somewhere between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ. The skeptics had been wrong. The Ethiopian Church had not embellished or invented the Book of Enoch. It had preserved, in complete form, a text so that fragments of it were circulating in Judea in the same centuries, and possibly the same communities that later produced Jesus and his first followers. The Ethiopic version turned out to be the closest thing scholars have to the full original shape of a book the rest of the ancient world had let slip through its fingers. That single vindication changed how seriously the entire Ethiopian canon was taken. If Ethiopia had preserved Enoch intact and unaltered for over 1,000 years while the rest of Christendom lost it completely, what else might still be sitting in those monastery libraries? The answer to that question arrived in a French archive at the turn of the 20th century, and it involved a text with a much more direct claim on the story of Jesus than the Book of Enoch ever made. Its subject wasn't a prophet from before the flood. Its subject was the risen Christ himself, describing, in his own words to his own disciples, exactly what resurrection and judgment would look like for every human being who had ever lived. The text is called the Apocalypse of Peter, and its own survival story runs almost parallel to Enoch's, minus the century of disbelief, because when it resurfaced, the physical evidence left no room for doubt. Early Christian writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries referred to this book constantly. Some of them treated it as legitimate scripture. Clement of Alexandria apparently wrote a commentary on it. It shows up on early canon lists sitting right alongside texts that did eventually become the New Testament, before later councils quietly dropped it. And then, like Enoch, it disappeared from view almost entirely, known to modern scholars only through second-hand quotations, until archaeologists working a Christian burial site at Akhmim in Upper Egypt during the winter of 1886 and 1887 opened the grave of a monk from the 8th or 9th century and found a small parchment book buried with him. Inside was a fragment of the Gospel of Peter, and bound with it, a fragment of the Apocalypse of Peter, written in Greek. It was the first physical confirmation in over 1,000 years that the book early Christians had argued about was a real, specific text and not simply a name attached to lost rumors. But the Akhmim fragment was incomplete. It broke off mid-vision, its description of hell cut short before the manuscript ended. Scholars had a fragment of a book whose full contents they still didn't know. And this is where the story turns back to Ethiopia, and to a set of manuscripts that had been sitting almost completely ignored in a Paris library for years. In the 19th century, a French explorer and scholar named Antoine Diabate had traveled through Ethiopia collecting manuscripts, eventually depositing a substantial collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Among them was a large body of pseudo-Clementine literature, religious texts framed as revelations dictated by the Apostle Peter to his disciple Clement of Rome. This material sat in the archive, catalogued but largely unexamined, until between 1907 and 1910 a French scholar named Sylvain Gribaut worked through it and published translations into French. It was only after reading Gribaut's published French translations that an English scholar named Montague Rhodes James, working independently, recognized in 1910 that one specific section of this Ethiopic Clementine collection was not simply devotional literature. It was a version of the very book the Akhmim fragment had broken off from mid-sentence. Not a fragment this time. A full text, considerably longer than the Greek remnant, framed under its own original title, which translates roughly as an account of the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the dead, revealed by Christ to Peter. What James had stumbled onto, sitting quietly in a Guizi manuscript catalogued years earlier and translated into French by someone else entirely, was the closest thing that exists to the complete Apocalypse of Peter. A second independent Ethiopic manuscript of the same work was later identified on an island monastery in Lake Tana in 1968, giving scholars two separate witnesses to compare, which only strengthened confidence that the Ethiopic tradition preserved the book's fuller original shape rather than a later expansion invented locally. The Greek fragment from the Egyptian tomb and the Ethiopic version from the Ethiopian church, produced continents apart and passed down through entirely separate transmission histories, matched closely enough in structure and content that there was no reasonable doubt they descended from the same second-century original. Once again, isolation had done what active preservation elsewhere had failed to do. So what does this text actually say? And why does its content matter so much for how we understand the earliest Christian ideas about resurrection? The Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter opens with a scene set explicitly after the resurrection on the Mount of Olives, where the risen Jesus is seated with his disciples gathered around him. They ask him directly for the signs of his return and the end of the world, wanting to know how to recognize the moment and how to instruct the generations of believers who would come after them. What follows is presented not as parable or metaphor, but as direct testimony, Jesus describing in explicit terms what happens to the human body and soul after death, how the dead will be raised, and precisely what awaits both the righteous and the condemned once judgment begins. It is, by design, one of the earliest surviving Christian attempts to answer the question every new convert must have asked in the 1st and 2nd centuries. If Christ has been raised, what does that actually mean for the rest of us when we die? The vision of judgment is detailed to a degree that has no real parallel in the canonical New Testament, where descriptions of the afterlife tend to be brief and symbolic. Here, the punishments assigned to different categories of sinners are matched to their specific offenses with an almost forensic precision. Those who spoke falsely against others are shown suspended by the part of the body responsible for their wrongdoing. Those who exploited or abused the vulnerable face torments that mirror the nature of their crimes. Murderers are placed in view of the very people whose lives they took. The text moves through a long catalog like this, category by category, before turning to a vision of paradise built as a direct counterweight, a place of light, fragrance, and rest reserved for those who had suffered persecution and stayed faithful to the end. Scholars widely read this structure as a response to a very specific historical moment, communities of Jewish and early Christian believers living under the threat or memory of real persecution, for whom a vivid, itemized promise of ultimate justice was not abstract theology but urgent reassurance. There is one detail in the Ethiopic version that scholars have found particularly striking, because it is not present in the shorter Greek Akhmim fragment and appears to reflect a genuine theological tension within the earliest Christian communities themselves. Toward the end of the text, after the punishments of the damned have been laid out at length, there is a passage in which the righteous are described interceding on behalf of the condemned, and the text gestures towards some form of ultimate mercy extended even to those who had been sentenced to punishment. Later scholars examining the Ethiopic translation have suggested that whoever produced this version, whether the original Ethiopic translator or an intermediate Arabic source now lost, appears to have softened or obscured the plainer language implied by the Greek tradition, likely because the idea of the ultimate salvation of the condemned was already considered a dangerous and controversial doctrine by the time later copies were made. In other words, the manuscript itself carries physical evidence of an old argument inside early Christianity about whether judgment was final or whether mercy eventually reached even the damned, an argument later Orthodoxy tried to close down, and one this text preserves the fingerprints of instead of erasing. This is the part of the discovery that deserves to be taken seriously rather than sensationalized. The Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter does not rewrite the resurrection of Jesus itself. It does not contain some hidden confession or secret history that contradicts the empty tomb accounts in the four Gospels. What it reveals is something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling to a modern reader who assumes early Christianity had one settled, uniform picture of resurrection and judgment from the very beginning. It didn't. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, communities of believers were still actively working out what resurrection meant in practice, drawing on Jewish apocalyptic imagery, Greek philosophical ideas about the soul, and their own lived experience of persecution to produce vivid, sometimes contradictory, pictures of what happened after death. Some of those pictures made it into the New Testament. Others, including one that Clement of Alexandria treated as authoritative scripture in the 2nd century, were eventually pushed out of the canon everywhere except in the one place isolated enough and reverent enough toward inherited tradition to keep copying it anyway. That is really the disturbing part, if there is one. Not that Jesus' resurrection is somehow undermined by this text, but that an entire detailed 2nd century Christian account of what resurrection and final judgment were supposed to look like, one that shaped how early converts understood their own deaths, was functionally erased from Western Christian memory for over 1,000 years, and would likely still be lost today if not for a set of cataloged but untranslated manuscripts sitting in a Parisian library and a monastery on an island. In an Ethiopian lake. It raises the uncomfortable question of how much else about the earliest Christian imagination, the raw, unfiltered, occasionally strange ways the first generations of believers pictured heaven, hell, and the risen body, has simply not survived anywhere at all, because it wasn't lucky enough to be preserved by a tradition the rest of Christendom consider peripheral. The pattern repeats across the Ethiopian canon in ways that go beyond just these two texts. The Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis and Exodus with an elaborate calendar system, survives complete only in Ethiopic, with fragments later confirmed among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the same way Enoch was. The Ethiopian New Testament includes church order documents like the Didascalia and the Synodos that preserve early instructions on baptism, ministry, and worship no longer found as complete units anywhere else. 3 books called Maccabean, unrelated in content to the Greek books of Maccabees despite the shared name, exist only within this tradition. Taken together, these texts amount to a substantial archive of the theological imagination of the earliest Christian and late Second Temple Jewish world, an archive that happened to survive because one church, on the edge of the ancient world's trade routes and largely outside the reach of the council's reshaping doctrine everywhere else, simply never stopped believing these books belonged to Scripture. It is worth being precise about what actually happened here, because the honest version of this story is compelling enough without exaggeration. Nobody found a suppressed gospel that rewrites the crucifixion. Nobody uncovered proof that the resurrection didn't happen the way the 4 canonical gospels describe it. What happened is that a real, historically significant, 2nd century Christian text describing the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment, a text ancient church fathers argued over, and in some cases treated as scripture, was recovered from total obscurity through a combination of careful cataloging, patient translation, and one scholar noticing, while reading someone else's French translation of an Ethiopian manuscript, that a piece everyone assumed was gone had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The manuscript evidence was later corroborated by an independent copy from a monastery on Lake Tana, and its antiquity was never seriously in doubt the way Enoch's had been, because the Akhmim fragment had already proven a Greek original existed in the 2nd century. What it leaves us with is not a conspiracy, but a genuine historical lesson about how fragile the record of early Christianity actually is, and how much of it survived by accident, by isolation, or by the stubborn devotion of a single monastic tradition that the rest of the Christian world had written off as marginal. Every one of these recoveries, Enoch through James Bruce and then the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Apocalypse of Peter through Diabetes' overlooked collection and M.R. James's careful reading, points to the same underlying truth. The Ethiopian Church was never a footnote to Christian history. For over 1,000 years, while empires rose and fell and councils in Rome and Constantinople decided what the rest of the world would be allowed to read as scripture, a community of monks in the highlands of East Africa kept copying every book they had ever been given, without asking whether it was still fashionable or theologically convenient to do so. What they preserved is now forcing scholars across the world to reconsider how much of the earliest Christian understanding of resurrection, judgment, and the world to come was ever fully represented in the Bible most people know at all.